The morning of July 10th, 1942, Albert Knack, a machinist mate, squeezed his observing the rolling fog while leaning against the chilly window of a PBY Catalina flying boat across the desolate hills of an Aleutian chain Akutan Island. His pilot for the past hour, Lieutenant William, had been missing, flying by dead and struggling to make ends meet in the dense weather. Glimpsed the tips of their own wings. They had no notion where they were supposed to be patrolling in the vicinity of Dutch Harbor, where Till Knack caught a glimpse of the Shumagan Islands through a cloud break. They were now slicing into Akutan, returning to base by the most direct way. Knack noticed it at that moment, a shadowy form half a mile inland from Broadbite in a green valley, an aircraft tail in the air, upside down. Even from above, Japanese marks are easily discernible, a Zero fighter unharmed. The one aircraft that for the previous 6 months had been killing American pilots at a 12-to-1 ratio. You made 2 circles to validate their observations. The Zero appeared quite flawless. No significant harm, simply waiting while sitting on the marsh grass. After noting the location on the map, they headed towards Dutch Harbor. What they had just discovered, the most precious intelligence prize in the entire Pacific. But neither of them realized it. War. An aircraft that would make public all the secrets the Japanese had been utilizing to control the skies ever since Pearl Harbor. But it would take 3 different recovery efforts to get that aircraft off Akutan Island and into American hands. Efforts, 2 months of labor, and a degree of confidentiality that would decide which dogs survived and which did not battle over the ensuing 2 years. On December 8th, 1941, 6 months prior, the Philippines had been devastated by the Japanese. At the conclusion of the first week, 37 pilots from the United States were deceased. The Zeros unexpectedly appeared, outpacing all previous American sightings in speed and maneuverability. Physically feasible. Their rate of ascent was 5,000 feet per minute. They might turn inside every move that American combatant tried. With a range of more than 1,500 meters, they could escort bombers farther than anyone had imagined into enemy territory. Additionally, pilots who had been training flew them since 1937 for war. Combat veterans who have shot down 99 Chinese aircraft in China with just 2 Zeros lost to ground fire. Rumors about this aircraft had reached American intelligence. Reports from China reported a fighter that performed exceptionally well, but the majority of commanders believed the reports were inflated. Japanese aircraft were thought to be low-quality, inexpensive replicas of Western designs. The training manuals stated as much. The manuals were utterly incorrect. 78 of the Zeros flew in when they struck Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The initial wave. The American combatants who were able to take to the skies were just inferior. With a Zero, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was unable to climb. The Brewster with it, F-2A Buffalo, was unable to turn. Although the Grumman F-4F Wildcat was more resilient, less nimble and slower. Pilots lost their lives trying to dogfight the Zero. Up in the sky. During those first dreadful weeks, American pilots learned hard lessons over the Philippines. Captain Jesus Vilmore. As Zeros tore through his formation, he flew an outdated P-26P gun. Only by plunging away at full throttle did they survive. The first American kill was confirmed by Lieutenant Randall Keaton. On December 8th, against a Zero, although his squadron lost 11 planes that day. When the Japanese bombers arrived, 18 P-40s were sitting on the runway at Clark Field. The 18 were all destroyed on the ground. The pilots never took to the skies. January 1942 saw the official U.S. The strategy was straightforward and degrading. Run away if you come upon a Zero. Take a dive for the deck. Utilize the superior dive speed of your bigger aircraft and exit the battle. Avoid attempting to turn it. Avoid attempting to climb with it. Simply run. Additionally, even that wasn't always effective. In February 1942, Allied pilots flying over Java. Battle after battle saw Zeros for P-40s and Hurricanes. The kill percentage was terrible. 10 aircraft were lost by the Allies for each Zero shot down. In Darwin, on February 19, 1942, a single Japanese bomber raid occurred in Australia, and there were 23 Allied planes destroyed by Zeros. The Zero appeared to be unbeatable. Returning pilots from warfare spoke of it with a devotion that was almost supernatural. A dime may turn it on. It might take off like a rocket. It may spend hours in the air. According to several pilots, the Zero had no flaws at all. However, one man declined to acknowledge the invincibility of the Zero. The fighting squadron's commanding commander was Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. Early in 1942, 3VF-3 was based in San Diego. Since 1930, he had worked as a test pilot, gunnery instructor, and aviator. He was renowned for his ability to plan strategically, for spending his evenings practicing combat situations, and for using matchsticks on his kitchen table to mimic formations of aeroplanes. The spring of 1941 saw an intelligence bulletin detailing the Zero was sent to Thatch. The Fleet Air Tactical Unit provided the report. Bulletin on Intelligence, September 22, 1941. It described all of the Japanese fighter's capabilities: exceptional agility, 5,000 feet per minute, tiny turning radius, and ascent pace. His Wildcat was unable to compete with any of it. For weeks, Thatch tried to come up with a tactical solution every evening. The typical American combatant, 3 planes, a leader, and 2 wingmen made up the formation. It had been in use ever since World War I, but Thatch understood that pilots had to spend too much time in formation. They paid too much attention to their leader and not enough to potential dangers. He changed to an element with 2 planes. The leader and wingman are flying next to each other, separated by around a Wildcat's turning radius. These 2 components combined to form a partition of 4 planes. Both elements would turn towards one another when a Zero hopped one of them. The Zero, after lining up a shot on one element, the pilot would suddenly find himself up against 2 untamed cats. Him from the other side. He would engage in a head-on battle if he launched his attack. Should he separate, he would get on the tail of another element. Thatch referred to it as the position of beam defense. His pilots gave it a name. Otherwise, but they nevertheless practiced it. Thatch made arrangements for planes in May 1942. Significantly superior ability to attack Zeros during training sessions compared to Wildcats. Beam defense worked on each and every practice session. The assailants failed to acquire a clear shot. Every time, the defending Wildcats found themselves in a firing position. However, Thatch had never put it to the test with actual Zeros. He would receive that opportunity halfway. On June 4, 1942, in the morning, Lieutenant Commander 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were attacked under Lance Massey's command. Northeast of Midway Island, they ran across the Japanese carrier fleet. Torpedo's commanding commander was Massey. VT-3, Squadron 3. 6 Wildcats and Thatch from fighting. At a height of 1,500 feet above the torpedo bombers, Squadron 3 was flying escort. They were intended to keep Japanese fighters away from Massey's flight. However, the torpedo bombers quickly began their attack run. 20 Zeros jumped out of the sun and ripped into the formation after 8 a.m. Thark's 4-plane division, which included him, Lieutenant Brainerd Macoma, N.N. Robert Dibb, his wingman, and Enan Edgar Bassett made an effort to interact. Bassett struck his Wildcat right away. The Zero pilot punctured the fuselage of Bassett. The Wildcat tilted in the direction of the water and burst. Dibb and McMumba were summoned by Thatch to accompany him into the beam protection. They faced one another. Macoma was surrounded by a Zero. Dibb followed Thatch as he swung sharply towards Macoma. Thatch was spotted by the Zero pilot, heading directly at him, but he was determined to assault nevertheless. Thatch pressed the button. He has 4 50 caliber machines, 1 20mm cannon, and several guns pounded out a 3-second burst. The rounds moved up the fuselage of the Zero. The fragments soared away. The engine of the Zero burst into flames, and black smoke trailed behind the plane as it vanished. Beam defense was used for the first kill. However, there were 19 more Zeros, and there were just 3 Wildcats remaining. He had a Zero on his tail, Dibb called. Thatch turned in his direction. Dibb looked over at Thatch. They happened to cross paths. The Zero. The pilot flew straight into Thatch's firing cone while attempting to follow Dibb around the bend. Thatch struck him in the head. Exploded. The Zero caught fire and lost some of its engine cowling. Secondly, murder. They continued to weave in and out. Another Zero every 20 to 30 seconds would launch an assault. The weaving would set up one of the Wildcats for a deflection shot every 20 to 30 seconds. Makoma's there was no radio. He followed the twists and remained in formation, unable to hear that Thatch's orders. After 17 minutes of nonstop fighting against 20 Zeros, 3 Wildcats made it out alive. 3 verified kills were shot down by Thatch. Dib received 1. While Massey and all 12 Devastators were shot, they lost 1 Wildcat. Down. Not 1 torpedo struck. The attack claimed Massey's life. His wingman passed away. All of the squadron's pilots perished. Although the beam defense stance was effective, pilots had to understand the strategy, to trust it, practice it. It was unknown to most squadrons. Additionally, American pilots were still only not winning, but surviving. Better tactics alone were not enough for American pilots. They have to be aware of the Zeros, shortcomings. They had to know how it handled under -G, how it rolled, and how it operated at high speeds. Forces. They required real flight characteristics and test data from an intact nothing. Additionally, that Zero was around halfway through Thatch's battle for survival, to fall 45,500 meters north on Akutan Island. Petty was the pilot's name. Tadayoshi Koga, first-class officer. He was born on September 10th and was 19 years old. Rural Japan in 1922. A carpenter's son, he is little for a pilot, just 5 feet tall. But he was assigned to the carrier Ryuo, flying Zero serial number 4593 after completing pilot school. On February 19, 1942, the aircraft departed the Mitsubishi Nagoya facility. Almost brand new, only 3.5 months old. June 4th saw the introduction of Koga as a 3-plane segment from the Ryujo. Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo led his section. His other petty officer, Sugu Shikata, was the wingman. Dutch Harbor, a naval base, was their aim. Base in the Illusions on Unalaska Island. During the battle, the attack was a component of a diversionary maneuver of the middle. In order to attract American naval troops north, the Japanese Midway Island was struck from the west by the main carrier attack force. Koga's portion was included in the strategic feint deceit. They'd hit Dutch Harbor enough to give the Americans serious concerns. Through the Illusions, there came an invasion. Dutch Harbor was attacked by Koga's unit just after 8 o'clock on June 4th, bombing and strafing American facilities. The Americans retaliated despite the base's weak defenses. With all of their possessions, the 206th Coast Artillery Regiment fired 50 rounds. Caliber machine guns at the Zeros that are attacking. Ships in the harbor have their own fire added by sailors. Rounds of small arms permeated the atmosphere. Some didn't, but the majority did. While making a pass, Koga's Zero absorbed a number of blows. Small arms fire, most likely in the 50 caliber range. A single bullet cut off his primary oil supply. The line returned to the engine from the oil cooler. His engine would run out of oil in a matter of minutes without it. Koga saw that the oil pressure gauge was falling. He was able to see a heavy trail of oil was seen in the sky behind his plane. The temperature of his engine was increasing. Within 5, the engine would fail, and the plane would plummet in a matter of minutes or perhaps fewer. He traveled southwest towards Akutan Island after radioing his section leader. Akutan was identified by the Japanese as in place for emergency landings. Offshore, a submarine was positioned to retrieve downed pilots. Half a mile inland from the coast, the island appeared to have a long, level, grassy valley. From above, it appeared ideal for a last-minute landing. An extended expanse of solid, smooth green, or so it seemed. Koga made 1 lap around the valley. Now his engine was struggling, the temperature was rising, and there was oil almost 0 pressure. He might have had 2 minutes before the engine died entirely, as his wingman, Shikata, went around with him. Shikata saw something on the second pass. The grass appeared strange. It had a gleam about it. Sunlight reflected on water. Abruptly, he became aware of what he was witnessing. The ground wasn't solid. It was a secret bog wetland, below the knee-high grass. Shikata attempted to tell Koga to land on your belly. Koga's engine was failing, though, so keep the gear up. His landing gear was down, with his flaps down. He was determined to land with his wheels down. No time was available to change. Shortly after the assault on Dutch, Kog's wheels made contact with the grass. Harbor was over. They plunged right into the mud. The Zero was propelled by its momentum ahead. The wheels sank farther. The tail emerged. The plane violently flipped, hurling a cloud of grass, mud, and water. When it came to rest inverted, the engine was buried in the bog, the tail sticking skyward. Koga remained securely fastened. The cockpit suspended from his harness inverted. His neck was broken in the impact. He passed away right away. His head had snapped forward from the shock of slowing down as the wheels became stuck in the mud, with deadly force. Overhead, Koga's wingmen circled. Shikarda and Endo observed the collision. The Zero flip was visible to them. They watched it fall to rest upside down. They were unable to see Koga. They had no idea if he was dead or alive. Pilots from Japan had been directed on a regular basis to eliminate any Zero that crashed in enemy territory. The directives were clear and straightforward. Punish the wreckage, burn it, make it useless. Keep an intact Zero out of the hands of the Americans. The Americans had been, since the start of the conflict, they have been attempting to obtain a flyable Zero. Although each wrecked Zero had been examined, all had been too much damage. This one appeared nearly flawless, just inverted. If Koga was still living, he would die strafing the plane. Shikarda and Endo saw no signs of life or movement, but they couldn't be sure. For a few minutes, they circled in the hopes of seeing nothing. Koga climbed out. Offshore, the submarine was waiting. They were forced to depart, prior to the arrival of American planes. Fuel for Japanese fighters was scarce. The assault was over. It was time to go back to the Rujo. Shikarda and Endo came to a decision. They flew back to their carrier without destroying the Zero. They had disregarded their directives. They were aware of the consequences. Although they were aware that an entire Zero in American hands would be disastrous for Japan, they were unable to bring themselves to murder their companion. The human choice in that compassionate moment would alter the Pacific War. For 36 days, the crash scene was left untouched. Island of Akutan is among the world's most isolated locations. Barren, volcanic, nearly invariably encased in fog. The weather on the Aleutian Islands is among the worst in the world. Wind, rain, fog, and cold. The valley where Koga crashed was not visible from normal flying routes. Inland, ships passing the island were unable to sight. The view was obscured by the landscape. Throughout June and the first week of July, the Zero remained there, gradually sinking. Farther down in the bog, fog rolled through, rain dropped. The Zero became comfortable in the dirt, but was mostly undamaged. In fact, the inverted position was beneficial. Keep it safe. The weather was kept out of the cockpit and power plant. In July, Lieutenant William Thess and his PBY crew discovered the Zero on the 10th of 1942 by pure chance. Because they cut around the island rather than flew, they were able to locate the wreckage after becoming disoriented in the fog, all surrounding it. On July 11th, the next day, a recovery team took off to evaluate the circumstance. The team was led by Lieutenant Robert Kerms. After landing on the shore, they traveled through rocky terrain for half a mile inland. Landscape. Upon arriving at the scene of the collision, they discovered Koga's body still inside the cockpit, dangling upside down from his harness. Carefully, they extracted him. It was obvious that his neck was shattered. They saw that the angle was incorrect. They excavated a burial on a neighboring hill with a view of the valley. Despite lacking a chaplain, they buried Koga as properly as conditions permitted. They marked the grave with stones. Next, they looked at the Zero. Kerms took notes as he slowly made his way around the aircraft. The airframe was undamaged. There was no significant damage to the wings. It had a straight tail. The Dutch harbor attack had left a few bullet holes in the fuselage, but nothing too serious. The engine came into view, unharmed. Despite being bent from the incident, the three-blade Sumitomo propeller was still repairable. The landing gear was sheared. When the wheels became stuck in the bog, they came off. It bent the vertical stabilizer. There was twist in the rudder. The tips of the wings were. The aeroplane was in exceptional shape overall, notwithstanding scratches, flap damage, and a fractured canopy. This Zero might be able to fly once more. Kerms promptly returned to Dutch Harbor. The Navy moved quickly. They sent a salvage crew with large machinery, but the environment resisted. The lifting equipment's ship went missing. In the harsh Aleutian currents, 2 anchors are attempting to maintain their position. The Aleutian's tides can shift 15 feet in 6 hours. Often, winds surpassed 50 miles per hour. The rescue crew was unable to relocate the Nothing. It was buried deep in the muck and weighed more than 5,000 pounds. The bog retained it similar to a vice. They had to abandon it and make another attempt. On the 15th of July, a third better equipment was brought by the recovery team. They brought a barge, wires, and a portable crane. They were employed for 2 days in horrible conditions. They could not see 20 feet due to the dense fog and cold rain. The muck was like glue. Cables were rigged beneath the fuselage of the Zero. The crane struggled. Slowly, the cables traveled taut. The Zero started to make a move. The airframe was sucked up by mud. The aeroplane ripped loose with a wet tearing sound. They dragged it to its feet. Mud and water flowed from the engine cowling and cockpit. They let it to drain. Then started the difficult process of transporting it to the coast by land. A makeshift route through the swamp had to be constructed. They lay out planks of wood. The Zero was dragged inch by inch. They arrived at the barge after another full day. At the Zero was flipped right side up in Dutch Harbor and the worst of the mud. Despite its squalor, the aircraft was recoverable. They placed it in the USS St. Miles cargo hold, a cargo vessel. They wrapped and fastened the Zero. Guards with guns kept vigil. The contents of the hold could not be known. On July 20th, the St. Miel set sail for Seattle. The journey took 12 days, across choppy North Pacific waters. August 1st marked the ship's arrival in Seattle. The Zero then traveled to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California, via barge. The North Island had safe facilities and some of the top airplane mechanics in the Navy. North Island was reached by the Zero on. Inside a hangar, the Navy surrounded it with a 12-t-high stockade on August 12th. Marines in uniform were on duty around the clock. No one without written permission was permitted near the aircraft. From the commander of the base, there was a genuine risk of souvenir seekers. One was taken. Element might jeopardize the intelligence operation as a whole. In complete secrecy, the place-to mechanics worked. They recorded each component that was taken out. Every dimension was measured. They took pictures of everything. They carefully adjusted the vertical stabilizer while looking for signs of metal fatigue. They fixed the rudder, making sure it traversed its entire range without restriction. The wingtips were swapped out with manufactured parts that matched the original requirements. They tested the hinge points and fitted the flaps. The landing struts that were sheared off in the collision were replaced with new ones. Despite being bent, they carefully repaired and repurposed the original 3-blade Sumitomo propeller. They applied a patch, the Dutch Harbor bullet holes, and covering them with aluminum patches. The original crimson Hinamaru was repainted, circular with the white star and American blue circle symbol. The complete procedure of repair required 6 weeks of meticulous labor. 2 months and 16 days later, on September 20th, 1942, the Zero was prepared for flight just days after Koga crashed on Akutan. Lieutenant the pilot for the test would be Commander Eddie Sanders. Sanders was 31 years old. Since 1938, he had been posted to Naval Air Station Anacostia as a Navy test pilot in Washington. He was renowned for his technical insight and accuracy. Not ostentatious, not an ace, just a systematic pilot with a thorough understanding of aircraft technology and the ability to express his feelings while using the controls. The Navy required a person who could pilot the Zero and gather all of its technical information. Sanders was the ideal individual for the position. At 9 a.m. on September 20th, Sanders climbed inside the cockpit of the Zero for the first time. The cockpit was significantly smaller and more claustrophobic compared to a Wildcat. Even though Sanders was a small man, he felt constrained. The chair very difficult, with little padding. Japanese pilots were chosen in part due to their diminutive size. A pilot who was taller than 5 feet would be difficult to fit. In contrast to American airplanes, the instrument panel was straightforward. Gauges for engines on the left, pressure, oil temperature, manifold, tachometer, and oil pressure. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, turn, and bank, and flight instruments in the center indicator. On the right was everything else: hydraulic pressure and fuel indicators. Every label was written in Japanese. Even after studying translations, it seemed strange to Sanders. He located the throttle, the mixture control, the landing gear handle, the flap, and the propeller pitch lever command. Everything was in its proper place. It was just arranged differently. Sanders turned on the engine of the Nakajima Sakai. After coughing once, the engine caught and settled into a slick lull. The sound was higher pitched than that of an American engine. The propeller arc was visible on Sunday morning. The aircraft vibrated, yet it was lighter and less solid than a Wildcat. The entire airframe felt fragile. Sanders looked at the gauges. Pressure of oil typical. The temperature is gradually rising. Good fuel pressure. He turned the throttle up, just a little. The engine started up right away, crisp without hesitation. He let go of the brakes, then taxied in the direction of the runway. The Zero rolled with ease. The rear wheel. The steering was responsive and light. Almost too light. It would require some getting accustomed to. As well. On the runway, Sanders formed a queue. He easily moved the throttle forward. The Zero picked up speed quite rapidly. Because it was lightweight, it was quick acceleration. Sanders retracted the stick at 60 knots. The Zero sprang to the air. Remarkably brief, the takeoff roll was perhaps half of what a Wildcat required. Sanders withdrew the landing apparatus. There was a firm clunk from the gear. He lifted the flaps. The Zero made a steep ascent. The climb rate was evident right away. The Zero was ascending at a rate of more than 4,000 feet per minute, possibly near 5,000. It was remarkable. Sanders started testing basic handling after leveling off at 5,000 feet. He flew level and straight. The Zero had good tracking. It remained steady. The controls were precise but felt light. At low speeds, the plane seemed responsive and lively. He attempted a soft turn. The almost effortlessly Zero swung into the turn. The low-speed roll rate was outstanding. He turned around once more. The Zero answered right away. Sanders increased the air's velocity. Around 170 miles per hour, or 150 knots, the controls still felt light, responsive, accurate, and typical. He could feel the ailerons at 180 knots, tighten just enough to provide a small amount of resistance. At 230 miles per hour and 200 knots, the ailerons went cold. Sanders attempted to roll the plane. He gave the stick a forceful push to the right. The ailerons did not move at all. The control surfaces seemed to be locked. Both hands were required of him, and much force only to initiate a modest roll. The control was covered in fabric. Surfaces were rapidly inflating due to air pressure. They were growing stiff and unyielding. At 250 revolutions per minute, the Zero could not be rolled at any practical rate due to physical constraints. A pilot might exert all of his energy and possibly a few bank degrees each second. That was nothing in battle. An American A pilot in a Corsair or Wildcat may roll quickly to the right or left, and the Zero was unable to follow. Sanders took thorough notes. This was crucial. More than 200 knots caused everything to alter. Sanders conducted bidirectional roll rate tests. It was easier for the Zero to roll to the left than the right. There was a noticeable asymmetry with a 20% disparity, most likely connected to propeller rotation and engine torque. As seen from the cockpit, the engine rotated in a clockwise direction. It caused a moment of rolling to the left. The aerodynamic forces were too great for the fabric control surfaces. The torque impact became more apparent at high speeds. A rolling left Zero had a little edge. There was a disadvantage to a Zero rolling right. Pilots from America could take advantage of that. Roll hard right if you had a Zero on your tail. The Zero pilot would find it even more difficult to follow. Sanders then experimented with negative G maneuvers. He reached 10,000 feet. He forced a dive by pushing the nose down, accelerating to 250 knots. He tugged, pushed forward suddenly to unload the wings after pushing back hard on the stick. 0 grams, then -1 gram, and finally -2 grams. The engine sputtered, coughed, and almost died. Sanders felt the power go out. The engine was barely making any thrust, but the propeller continued to windmill. He shoved coming back positive Gs with the nose down. Once more the engine caught. Strength came back. He gave it another go. The same outcome. A float was employed in the Zero's power plant. Carburetor type. The float valve was unable to keep fuel pressure stable when acceleration was negative. The carburetor famished. The engine died. If a pilot from the United States forced his plane into a dive, The Zero who was following him would lose strength and lag behind him if he received negative Gs. Numerous lives could be saved by that one flaw. Sanders took a 90-minute flight, minutes of the initial trip. He experimented with spins, stops, climbs, dives, and slow flying. His recorded top speed was approximately 330 miles per hour. Not great, but respectable. The Wildcat had almost the same speed. The latest Hellcat and Corsair would be quicker. He tested a remarkable rate of ascent, more than 4,000 feet per minute, between sea level and 10,000 feet. No matter what America had flying, the Zero could outclimb it. Turn radius was examined at several speeds. The Zero could turn extremely tight at low speeds, more combative than any American planes. However, the turn radius significantly expanded at 200 knots. The weight of the controls made it impossible to make sharp turns. After 90 minutes, Sanders landed. Minutes. He shut off and taxied in. Officers and engineers waited in a mob on the hangar. Everyone was eager to learn what he had found. Sanders ascended from the cockpit. Sweat was dripping from his flight suit. His hands hurt from battling the controls quickly. He approached the superior commander directly. His initial remarks were straightforward. He informed them that he had discovered important flaws that American pilots could take advantage of. At speeds greater than 200, the ailerons froze. Knots. At high speeds, rolling maneuvers were slow and needed a lot of force. It was easier for the Zero to roll to the left than the right. Negative acceleration caused the engine to cut out. Now they had responses, actual intelligence that can be put to use. Sanders conducted 24 test flights between October 15th and September 20th. More data was discovered with each flight. He examined the in-simulated warfare, Zero against a Wildcat. The pilot of the Wildcat attempted every maneuver. The Zero was under total control at low speeds. It may always spin inside the Wildcat. However, when the Wildcat utilized speed, high-speed reversals and diving attacks, the Zero was unable to adhere to. The roles were entirely reversed. Sanders put weapons to the test. The Zero has two 20mm cannons in the wings and two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose. The machine guns were rifle-caliber weapons that couldn't compete with American armored planes. The cannons worked well, but only had 60 rounds of ammunition per rifle. After blasting for a few seconds, and they were devoid. The throttle, not the control stick, had the trigger installed, a unique design. Sanders discovered it's uncomfortable. He checked the visibility. The canopy offered superior visibility and more dependable than a Wildcat in most directions. However, there was a big blind area in the back, as well as below. The view was obscured by the headrest. An American pilot leaping from above and behind might remain in that blind space right up until the very last minute. Sanders put durability to the test. The Zero was incredibly light in construction. By American standards, the aluminum skin was thinner. There are no self-sealing fuel tanks and armor surrounding the cockpit. In the correct location, a few 50 caliber rounds may inflict disastrous harm. The Zero wasn't made to survive. It was made to perform. It was a brawl with knives. It was delicate, but lethal if it came close. Everything was recorded by Saunders in his official document. He claimed that the first flight revealed American flaws pilots could take advantage of with the right strategy. He explained what the aileron freeze was. At more than 200 knots, the asymmetric roll rate was explained by him. He explained the carburetor issue when G is negative. He offered particular suggestions. It is not advisable for American pilots to turn battles at slow speeds. They ought to employ altitude-based dive strikes, creating velocity above 250 knots. After one shooting pass, they ought to zoom back to altitude based on climb rate and pace. To get out, they ought to do negative G dives. If they had a Zero on their tail, the Zero couldn't follow that path as readily, thus they should roll hard right. At roughly 200 knots, they should, before the Zero pilot could align his crosshairs, roll hard. Top secret status was given to Sanders' report and dispersed over the Pacific Fleet's combat units. However, it was one thing to read a report, observing. On the other hand, the Navy chose to hold live protests. Lieutenant Melvin Hoffman was tasked with piloting the Zero against recently trained pilots in simulated battle. Hoffman worked as a test pilot, based at Anacostia Naval Air Station. Boogie was his call sign. Since 1941, he had been a Wildcat pilot. At the end of October 1942, Hoffman was given directives to use the C-0 in dogfighting exhibitions. Pilots were to be trained by the Navy utilizing the real planes they would be battling. Demonstrate to them how to take advantage of the flaws Sanders had found. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, protests were placed over San Diego Bay. Every interaction was planned to test particular strategies. Low-speed turning was demonstrated in the first demonstration. Fights. Hoffman piloted the Zero against 4 recently graduated Wildcat pilots. Instruction. The Wildcats attempted every tactic they were aware of. Hoffman followed them about at all times. The Zero was just too nimble at slow speeds. The Wildcats would have been shot down one by one. The pilots who are students seen Hoffman easily outmaneuver them. They internalized the lesson. Avoid fighting a Zero at all costs. Slow speeds. You will always lose. High-speed diving attacks were demonstrated in the second demonstration. The pilots of the Wildcat began at 10,000 feet. Hoffman began at 5,000 feet in the Zero. The Wildcats. When the speed reached 250 knots, it plunged and rolled inverted. Hoffman attempted to follow. He attempted to roll the Zero. Hoffman was seen fumbling with the controls by the students on the ground. The roll of the Zero was excruciatingly slow. After finishing their dives, the Wildcats pulled out at 2,000 feet and quickly returned to the sky. Hoffman continued to strive for the Zero. Pointing down. The Wildcats were scrambling away by the time he rolled in. The pupils comprehended right away. Quickly hit the Zero. Don't slow down, make speed your weapon. The third, the negative G escape was demonstrated. A Wildcat pilot allowed in the Zero. Hoffman gets on his tail. Hoffman moved to the line of fire. From the ground, the Wildcat appeared to be done. The Wildcat pilot then forcefully pushed over into a dive, dumping the wings. -2 GS is negative. Hoffman attempted to follow. The Zeros. The engine sputtered, coughed, then shut off. The exhaust sprayed black smoke. Ineffectively, the propeller windmilled. Hoffman slipped behind, frantically attempting to start the engine again. The Wildcat pilot raised the nose, increased range, recovered positive Gs. The engine of the Zero caught and began up again, but by that time the Wildcat was ascending and 2,000 feet away. The smoke trail was observed by the students. From the engine of Hoffman, they witnessed the Zero's rapid power outage. They recognized that if a Zero appears on the Zero can't follow, so use negative Gs, push over hard, and use the tail. Months passed during the protests. The training program rotated through hundreds of pilots. They all flew against Hoffman in the Zero that was taken. In real flight, each one witnessed the Zero's shortcomings. Everyone discovered the strategies that would sustain them. Pilots who completed the course were always talking about it. They outlined their observations. They described the strategies. By the beginning of 1943, the Pacific Fleet had heard the news. The Zero was not without flaws, particular vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Avoid turning at slow speeds. Assault by fast and at a high altitude. Right at high speeds, roll forcefully, make use of negative Gs to get away. The strategies were successful. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth is a Marine Corps pilot. Walsh completed the training at the beginning of 1943. Later, Walsh would shoot down 21 Japanese airplanes during the conflict. He gave the Akutan Zero credit years later, training while repeatedly saving his life. With a Zero on his tail, he knew what to do, and the information that arrived from Koga's Zero repeatedly saved his life. His Inutu was echoed by other pilots. Evaluation. The Zero that was taken was a priceless find. No other captured machine had never revealed so many secrets at such a critical moment. January American pilots started shooting down Zeros in 1943 at startling rates. Japanese leaders. The kill ratio began to change. In July 1942, before the Akutan Zero was tested, the ratio had been 12 Japanese kills for everyone the United States lost. 4 months after the start of the training demonstrations, in March 1943, the proportion was almost equal. American pilots were killing more Zeros by June 1943 than they were losing. Despite the arrival of new aircraft, the difference was not due to improved aircraft. The Wildcat was the main combatant in numerous squadrons. Knowledge was the cause of the change. American pilots were aware of the Zero's performance. They were aware of when it was susceptible and when it was harmful. They were able to forecast what it would be successfully countered by Zero pilot. The Japanese were unable to comprehend why their strategies were failing. Since 1937, Zero pilots had been employing the identical fighting strategies. In China, they had performed flawlessly. They had been employed at Pearl Harbor. They had worked in the Dutch East and the Philippines, over the Coral Sea in Burma, in the Indies. Abruptly at the beginning of 1943, those methods ceased to function. Turning fights were being avoided by American pilots. They were launching an aerial assault with fast dives. The Zero couldn't keep up with the speed at which they were rolling away. Pilots from Japan made an effort to adjust. In an attempt to compel the Americans to engage in slow-speed combat, they attempted tighter spins, but the American pilots refused. To pivot, they would strike, then use altitude and speed to increase range. No, the Japanese tried to lure the Americans, but they refused. Japanese pilots attempted a fierce chase, closing the range before the Americans' escape. However, American pilots employed negative G dives, which in some way led to issues with chasing Zeros. Why their engines were cutting out was beyond the comprehension of the Japanese pilots. They were aware that negative G maneuvers should be avoided generally, but they lacked precise information regarding fuel pressure loss. They didn't comprehend how the carburetor worked. They simply understood that occasionally chasing an American fighter who dives caused a power outage at the most inconvenient time. Japanese pilots attempted to make up for their bad high-speed roll rate by predicting the destinations of Americans. However, American pilots were unpredictable in their escape routes. Left, right, or straight down with negative Gs are all possible. There was no pattern to take advantage of. The main issue facing Japanese pilots was that their adversary had a deeper understanding of their aircraft compared to what they did. American pilots were aware of the precise velocity at which the Zero's ailerons would secure 200 knots. They were aware of the asymmetric roll rate degradation, harder right, easier left. Under negative Gs, they were aware of the carburetor problem. They had witnessed it, proved, they had prepared for it. General knowledge was possessed by Japanese pilots. They were aware of how the Zero handled poorly when moving quickly. However, they lacked numbers. There was no performance envelope chart displayed, precisely where the flaws were found. Pilots from the United States did. One complete Zero sitting was the cause of the knowledge gap. In a San Diego hangar, it was also killing Japanese pilots on a daily basis. Intelligence officers from Japan studied the debris of American fighters that had been shot down. They recorded advancements in U.S. aircraft. The F-6F Grumman Hellcat went into service at the beginning of 1943. Compared to the Zero, it was quicker, more powerfully equipped, and capable of suffering additional harm. The VAFF-4U Corsair had superior high-altitude performance and was even faster. Performance. With its two engines, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning could outrun anything that is high up. According to Japanese observers, American aircraft technology had advanced to the point where it exceeded the Zero. Their fighters were losing to better jets. That was partially, it's true, they were better, the new American planes. However, the true benefit wasn't only the plane, it was the strategy. The older Wildcats pilots were murdering Zeros at higher rates as well. Regardless of the type of aircraft, the techniques were effective. The information was effective, opposing every Zero. First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a Marine, on January 12, 1944, 5 Zeros were shot down by a Corps pilot from Vella La Vella, flying an F-4U Corsair in a one mission. He employed the fast-moving attack strategies that were created using the Akutan Zero data. Take a dive from above, increase your speed above 250 knots, execute one firing pass, zoom returning to the airborne position. Don't ever turn, never slow down. Don't ever allow the Zero to make use of its exceptional low-heat agility. In the 17 days that followed, Hansen shot down 15 additional Zeros employing the same strategies. 17 days, 20 kills. The Zero had changed from pilots who were aware of its flaws, practiced targeting the most dreaded fighter in the Pacific. By the middle of 1944, The American fighters suffered terrible losses. Shooting for the Great Marianas Turkey on June 19th and 20th, 1944 caused over 650 Japanese planes to be lost compared to 123 American planes. Zeros and other carrier aircraft accounted for the majority of the Japanese losses. The conflict happened close to Guam over the Philippine Sea. Fighter pilots from the United States operating F-6, F Hellcats, and Japanese formations were decimated by F-4U Corsairs using strategies that took use of every flaw shown by the Akutan Zero. Skilled Zero pilots who had survived the early stages of the conflict were being killed by American pilots who had only been in action for a few months. The pilots from America weren't any better. Naturally, they simply knew more. Akutan Zero was still at North Island, doing frequent demonstration flights until 1943. It was transported to Washington National Airport in late 1943 and shown as a war trophy. People waited in queue to view it. After 2 years of terrorizing Allied forces, the plane was now seated in an United States Navy emblem is painted on the fuselage of an American hangar. Photographers from newspapers snapped pictures. The Zero represented American tactical adaptation and technology espionage. The Zero was brought back to North Island in 1944 to continue serving as a training airplanes. Before deployment, recently commissioned pilots engaged in simulated combat against it, to the Pacific Ocean. It was always the same teachings. Keep it from turning. Attack quickly. Take use of its flaws. According to reports, the Akutan Zero was damaged in an accident during training. At North Island, the Zero was taxiing for takeoff when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver made a dive. As the bomber landed, it lost control. The landing gear of the Helldivers fell apart. The plane crashed into the Zero after skidding over the tarmac. The hell. Still spinning fast, diver's propeller cut like a saw into the Zero's fuselage. They cut the Zero, almost half. Fuel splattered across the tarmac. Both planes were written off as overall losses. With just minor wounds, the Helldiver's pilot lived. At the moment, no one was in the Zero, but the Pacific War's most precious intelligence resource was lost. It didn't matter by then. The Akutan Zero has done its job already. It had disclosed the mysteries of the Zero. It had taught hundreds of pilots. It had altered the Pacific air battle. The information it offered would never be lost. The PBY pilot who saw the Zero on July 10, 1942, was William Thies. Lived through the conflict. He persisted in conducting patrol flights during the Aviation campaign and thereafter in the Central Pacific. He flew anti-shipping strikes, search and rescue missions, and submarine patrols. He left his job in 1946 as a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He never got official acknowledgement for figuring out the Zero. His name can be found in operational reports, but the discovery never earned him a decoration. In 1989, Weiss passed away at age 7. His patrol pilot service was noted in his obituary, although it contained no information about the most significant finding of his professional life. The machinist mate who initially noticed the Zero from the window was Albert Knack. Of Thieves PBY continued to service in the Pacific until the war's conclusion. He took part in a lot of rescue and patrol missions. He went back to his native Michigan after the war and performed auto repair work. He hardly ever discussed seeing the Zero. It was just another patrol to him. Flying. He has witnessed many plane crashes. He was unaware that this one would alter the course of history. In 1994, Knack passed away at 78 years old. The first recovery team's leader, Robert Kerms, buried Koga on Akutan, kept up his service in the Pacific burial. He took part in amphibious activities in the Marianas and Gilbert Islands. A promotion to lieutenant commander was granted to him, and worked as an officer in charge of salvage operations. He worked in commercial shipping after the war. Kerms was unaware. The complete effect of the Zero he had assisted in recovering. It was only one of many to him. Salvage work he had done in the conflict. At age 86, he passed away in 2001. The Akutan Zero's maiden American flight was piloted by test pilot Eddie Sanders, who carried on his illustrious profession. He trained pilots and tested new aircraft while flying combat missions in the Pacific. He remained in the Navy after the war and became a Rear Admiral. He participated in the Cold War development of anti-submarine warfare, developing strategies and equipment to Soviet submarines. Sanders hardly ever talked about the Akutan Zero in public. The test flights continued, kept under wraps for years. when he was eventually interviewed by historians in the 1980s. At low speeds, the Zero is a great aircraft, but at high speeds, it clearly has limitations, according to Sanders. He claimed that once American pilots knew what such restrictions were, they could readily take advantage of them. Sanders passed away at the age of 87 in 1998. Melvin Hoffman, who led the K-9 becoming a rear admiral and combating protests. Throughout, he instructed hundreds of pilots in anti-Zero tactics. The conflict. He had a number of command posts following the war and contributed to the creation of jet fighter tactics during the switch to jet aircraft from propeller aircraft. Hoffman acknowledged that the Zero that was captured was among the most valuable. During the Pacific War, the Navy possessed training equipment. He claimed it was worthwhile to observe the Zero's flaws during actual flight. Thousands of intelligence reports. At age 87, Hoffman passed away in 2003. Thach John, who achieved full admiral status and created the beam defense position that became known as the Thach Wave. He kept improving, fighting strategies during the conflict. When kamikaze was used by the Japanese, Thach created the huge Blue Blanket defense system, a tiered fighter patrol, in response to attacks in late 1944. Mechanism that effectively guarded against airplane suicide. Following the conflict, Thach was the deputy commander-in-head of U.S. Naval Forces Europe after serving as chief of naval operations for the air. He went into retirement. 1967. Regarding the Pacific War's most significant tactical advancement, the captured Zero was constantly brought up by Thach. The Zero had been a mystery, he remarked, prior to Akutan. Following Akutan, it was merely another aircraft with well-known traits that could be taken advantage of. Shortcomings? At age 76, Thach passed away in 1981. The Tadayoshi up until 1947, Koga's remains were interred on Akutan Island. The American Graves Registration Service systematically searched graves at crash sites and on battlefields all over the Pacific. On the Kogas Akutan, they discovered Koga's burial and exhumed his body. His remains were interred in Attic Island Cemetery, which is located farther along the Audion chain was found in the area together with other Japanese war corpses. The Attic Cemetery was dug up in 1953. Japan received the return of 236 Japanese bodies. 13 were named. The Koga and the other 223 were re-enlisted in Chidori as unidentified troops. Tokyo's Gafuchi National Cemetery. Koga's family was never informed of his fate. All they knew was that he had died in combat close to the Illusions. They had no grave to visit, no body to bury. Not until the researchers identified Koga's ultimate resting site in the 1980s. In 1988, the United States Koga's destiny was investigated by Japanese businessman Minoru Kawamoto and novelist Jim Reedon. They discovered the now vacant original burial place on Akutan. They followed the documents through Koga's body was identified by the cemetery's registration agency as one of the unidentified remains returned in 1953. Later on, Reedon penned the definitive report on the Akutan Zero, detailing the complete account of how the aircraft was captured and how it affected the war. The Akutan was discovered by Japanese historians, the role of Zero decades after the conclusion of the war. Masataka Kumiya, a lieutenant general of a former pilot in the Imperial Navy and military historian for the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, examined the intelligence failure. He came to the conclusion that Japan suffered an equally severe blow from the acquisition of the Akutan Zero as it did from the Battle of Midway defeat. He claimed that Japan had lost hundreds of pilots as a result of losing one complete Zero. American pilots were able to neutralize all of the Zero's advantages, saving thousands of lives. The Akutan. Military historians have characterized Zero as a reward that is nearly worthless to the U.S. and most likely among the Pacific War's top intelligence awards. Museums still have small parts of the Akutan Zero. Aviation machinist William Leonard, who saw the plane crash in 1945 and destroyed it, saved a number of instruments and gauges from the debris prior to its removal. After preserving them for many years, he gave them to the U.S. Navy's National Museum, is located in the District of Columbia's Washington. The gauges are shown in a casing that has a little sign outlining where they came from. Anchorage's Alaska Heritage Museum contains a chunk of the control stick and pieces of aluminum skin. The National Air and Space Museum other minor components, such as a portion of the instrument panel, are at the museum, but the majority of the Akutan Zero was abandoned in 1945. There isn't a complete airframe anywhere. The only tangible remnants of the aircraft that altered the course of the Pacific War are bits and photographs. There's an image of Eddie Sanders taxiing the Zero in September from the collections of the San Diego Air and Space Museum shortly prior to its initial test flight on the 20th of 1942. The plane appears immaculate in the picture, American symbols clearly apparent, fresh paint, and the rising sun. White stars on blue circles took the place of the insignia. Sanders can be seen in the cockpit, his expression solemn and intent. The mechanics and other personnel around the aircraft guards observing history as it takes off. In further image from the National Archives depicts the Zero being lifted in July 1942 from the mud on Akutan Island. Members of the Navy stand around the airplane, still covered with mud. The tail is pointing up at the sky. The cables are situated beneath the fuselage. The image documents the instant when the most important intelligence resource of the after 36 days, the Pacific War, was finally released from the illusion swamp. That's how intellect wins actually take place during a conflict. Not through complex networks of spies, though those are important. However, not by code reading that alters conflicts. Sometimes a pilot is simply flying off course due to heavy weather. A perfectly timed machinist friend gazing out a window. A damaged plane making an emergency landing attempt on an island where no one was interested. Furthermore, two hostile pilots were unable to bring themselves to damage their friends' airplanes. Endo and Shikarda, Koga's wingmen, disobeyed explicit commands when on Akutan they did not destroy the Zero. The repercussions were known to them. They had been instructed on the significance of eliminating any Zero that ended up in the hands of the enemy. In American, they were aware of an intact Zero. Hands would be disastrous for the war effort in Japan. However, they were unable to strafe an aeroplane that might carry their lives. Comrade. That act of kindness, that essentially human choice, cost Japan the dominance of the air it had held since December 1941. One test pilots and one intact Zero thorough investigation, a single set of training exercises, and all of a sudden, American pilots had total understanding. They were aware of and able to steer clear of the Zero's advantages. They were aware of and able to take advantage of the Zero's flaws. They were aware of the precise air velocity at which the Zero appeared. Susceptible. When fleeing, they knew which way to roll. They were proficient in applying negative G-forces. To turn off the engine of a chasing Zero, they became hunters instead of victims. The Zero never bounced back from that loss of intelligence. It continued to be Japan's principal combatant until the end of the war, but only because it did not have the industrial capacity to create, test, and produce a substitute in large quantities. In 1945, the Zero was out of date, not because it wasn't improved by Japanese engineers. However, because American pilots were very aware of it, the instruction manual had been studied by them. They were able to control the situation since they had discovered all the secrets. Skies over the Pacific during the war's last 3 years. Please let us know if you thought this story was as captivating as we did. Please give this video a like. It enables us to tell more lost tales from World War II. Keep up with these unsung histories by subscribing. Each one shows how history was altered by people who frequently acted out of compassion or instinct. We would also be delighted to hear from you. Tell us where you are watching by leaving a comment below. Every continent is covered by our community, from individuals who recall these incidents to those who are learning about them for the first time. I appreciate you watching and preserving these stories.